There's nothing like it, is there? Bread and cheese in a wildflower meadow miles out in the countryside. Except this isn't miles out in the countryside. It's my back garden in suburbia on the edge of Birmingham. Now, my garden isn't particularly enormous. It's about the same size as all the others in the neighbourhood, about, I suppose, a tennis court in size. And yet, even so, I've managed to fit in the three main habitat types. I've got my wildflower meadow, I've got that wrapped around by a woodland edge, and then the centrepiece of the garden is a sort of mini wetland, a wildlife garden pond. And all of those different kinds of habitat are under threat. They're all disappearing from the countryside. So it's very important, since we've got 1 million acres of garden between us, that we do actually try and put something back, that we turn our gardens into good places for wildlife to live in. Well, that's what I tried to do. I started 5 years ago, and we've filmed the whole process. Once you've sorted out what exactly there is in the garden, then I think it's very well worthwhile, as a next step, putting everything down onto paper. It's so much easier to move things around on a piece of paper than it is to move ponds and shift trees around. And what I've done here is just to lay out, very simply, the general surroundings of the garden. And you can see that there is a terrace close to the house here, very important for sitting back on and enjoying the rest of it. And there's the greenhouse. And this area is the flower garden, cottage garden sort of planting, nice curving lines to the lawn, so it's easy to keep well mown. And then right across the middle of the garden, this large pond with stepping stones across it through the marshy area into the more natural part of the garden, with the footpath then curving around through the woodland edge and coming right back into the meadow and giving us a smashing view across the meadow, across the pond and back to the house. And once you've got that far, then it's very important, I think, to test it out on the ground. And what I do is use canes to just lay it out and see how it looks. And since the pool is the one thing that you really can't shuffle around afterwards, just very quickly and simply mark out the whole thing and see how it begins to shape up. Don't need to be too careful at first, just get them in and then juggle them afterwards. Now, what I'm doing is this end of the pool is going to be the deeper area, and at the far end it's going to narrow down for the stepping stones and the marshy area. So a nice big semicircular area at this end. And you can begin to see the thing taking shape. It's worth spending a few days just living with the whole thing. Once I'm happy with it, then the great thing is to actually get on and start digging the pond. Well, after a bit of juggling around with the canes, I finally decided exactly where I wanted the pond, a little bit nearer to the house, and with a few mates for a weekend, the job's almost done. It's a big hole and lots of soil, and I've kept some of the soil back, particularly the subsoil, to put back into the pool. The actual shape of the thing's very important. Nice, very gentle shelving edges so that lots of the plants will grow happily in the shallow water, and a promontory there in case any of the kids rush down off the lawn. At least they've got a few feet before they fall into the deep bit. And a shallow edge for plants as well, because many of the plants like that bit best. Deep water at one end, running right through to a very shallow area here, which is going to turn into marsh, a very good habitat for flag irises and toads and that sort of thing. The construction of the pool is very important as well. I've used a sort of sandwich here, a layer of polypropylene matting or felt, and then on top of that, the waterproof layer. It's a butyl rubber sheeting, very, very tough indeed. And on top of that, another layer of felt. And that should last for a lifetime. The felt underneath stops the sharp stones coming through and puncturing the rubber. and the felt on top stops the heron's beaks getting through. So a really tough job, and now the marsh is nearly finished. The key to making a nicely balanced wildlife pool is to establish the plants first. And I've created a whole range of habitats for different sorts of plants by shelving the edge. There are oxygenating plants like this one, which need to go right into the bottom. There are other plants that are rooted into the bottom with their leaves floating on the top. There are other plants which go into shallower water, and in shallower water but with their leaves right out of the water. And then there are other plants in the marsh. And the actual planting process is really very easy. If you can get into the water, then with the oxygenator, you simply need to weight the whole thing down with a brick. It's as simple as that. Trying to remember whereabouts the shallow bits are. And again, it's well to remember that this particular pond's got a good base to it, so I won't puncture it. Firm it down nicely, and that'll start churning out oxygen for everything else. Now, the floating plants, like water crow's foot, for instance, again, simply need to be bedded down into the soil. They'll very quickly recover and start to flower above the water surface. There's a little flower on there already. And the emergent plants, things like flag irises, for instance, and spearwort, can simply be planted in along the margin. And in no time at all, they'll start to grow like mad. Having plenty of depth in the middle of the pools really worked because the central areas stayed nice and open. But those plants that went into the shallows have just gone mad. Look at this. Greater spearwort really is a serious invader, and there's lots of water forget-me-not in there with this beautiful little blue flower as well, and musk and watermint, all growing like mad, moving out to the centre of the pond. So having dug the hole and put the plants in, you can't stop there. You've got a serious management problem year after year. The trouble with water plants is they don't know when to stop growing. And some of these things are just terrific. They send out great long shoots through the summer. And so every spring for the last 2 or 3 years, once the pond was established, I've had to come in here and pull out the excess. Now, this pond clearance work does create a couple of really quite serious problems. The first, fairly obvious, you can't do it without disturbing the wildlife. And so I try and do it at the very end of winter when you can actually see what the plants are, but before everything starts moving. And I always put the plants and all the debris on a tarpaulin at the side of the pond at least over one night, so that any of the little water shrimps and things that are stuck in there have a chance of wriggling out and down into the water. A lot of these water creatures are very shy, and they keep themselves well hidden most of the time. You're quite lucky to catch sight of them in daylight at all. In fact, you'll miss out on an awful lot of the most exciting pond life if you only go looking for it in the middle of the day. I love to creep out with a torch or a lamp last thing at night. It's surprising how much there is to see. Masses of tadpoles. We certainly won't be short of frogs next year. And here's a little smooth newt. Not so common these days, but more and more of them seem to turn up in this pond every year. But I've got one creature from the Black Lagoon that I'm particularly proud of. I can usually find it in the shallows on the other side of the pond. A great crested newt, one of Europe's officially endangered species, actually threatened with extinction, and I've got a whole colony of them breeding successfully in my wildlife garden. It's got to be worth making all the effort to get up at this time in the morning, at least once every spring, I think, and just see and listen to a whole different side of the garden. This incredible racket that starts at sort of 4:30 in the morning with dozens of birds singing away and just giving you a completely different view of the place. And even right in the middle of town, when there's no traffic around and no people around, it just is an amazing, magical sort of feeling. The longer I live with my wildlife garden, the more I'm reminded over and over again that very little of the wildlife lives in just one place. Take the dragonflies that breed in this pond, for instance. They spend most of their lives hunting along the hedgerows and the woodland edge. And the great crested newts are so successful here partly because they've got the pond to breed in, but then they've got the long grass to overwinter in around the edge of the meadow. Well, I say meadow. Most people think this is just a good excuse not to cut the grass. But I am actually about to cut it for the first time. I'm going to take my annual mini hay crop off. And I leave it this long so that the spring and summer flowers can actually set seed. The yellow rattle's rattling, a good sign that the seed's ripe, and there's a perfect clump of cowslip there as well. And although it does look a bit scruffy by the end of July, it really is a very colourful feature of the garden earlier in the year. My meadow's nice and mature now, but it's only as successful as this because I prepared it well right back at the beginning. The pond is very much the front edge of a woodland glade, and this whole grassland area I want to develop as a wildflower meadow for butterflies and for nectar plants. And obviously the first thing I've got to do, if this is all going to be a sheet of wildflowers by the summer, is get rid of these conifers. There's no easy way of doing this, it's just hard work. But end of March, beginning of April is a very good time of year to do it because conifers and most evergreens move best when they're just starting to grow. And I very much want to save this plant and use it elsewhere in the garden. So it's a matter of digging carefully all the way around and then teasing the thing out of the ground. I promised my mum I'd look after them. She loves conifers. The roots are fairly fibrous, so there's not an enormous root spread to deal with. Make sure that all of the roots are loose. And then should really just be a matter of gripping it by these thick branches in the middle, giving it a tug, and lifting it carefully out. I don't think my mum will ever forgive me for that. What I want is to blend this area into the rest of the wildflower meadow. So I shall leave this area now, it's reasonably level, for a couple of weeks, let the weed seedlings come up, let the whole thing settle so that it's a nice firm seed bed, and then somewhere around the middle to the end of April, sow it with just a very, very low rate of dwarf grass seed, wildflower seed, and treat it just like a normal lawn. By the end of the summer, with any luck at all, it should really be blending in and full of wildflowers. Well, it's early May, and everything's starting to grow like mad. I've already cut the path through the middle of the lawn twice, but I'm carefully not cutting this area because I'm trying to develop a community of wildflowers here. I've planted cowslips and snake's head fritillaries, and they've already flowered beautifully, but it's crucial that they're given chance now to set seed and for the seed to fall before I cut the plants down. So I won't be mowing this area of the lawn until probably mid-July at the earliest. Now, the area that used to be the conifer bed, I want to be meadow as well, but obviously there's no grasses and no wildflowers there at the moment. And this is a very good time of year to think about sowing grass seed. What I'm using is a mixture of fine grasses, no ryegrass at all, and meadow wildflowers. And because they're very small, I want to sow a very, very low rate, just a gram or two. So to make that possible, I've mixed it with silver sand, which is a very good way of just spreading the seed more thinly. Makes it much easier to sow. The whole lot just wants spreading very thinly. It's really good having left the soil for a week or two because it's settled down and made a very firm seed bed, which makes a big difference to the germination rate of these fine seeds. And you can see what a difference it makes having the silver sand in. It's just so much easier to see what's going on. You can see whether you're getting a nice even coverage, which I'm not. Once you've covered the whole surface, the whole thing can just be raked in very gently. And you can see how much easier it is to see what you're doing by bulking the whole thing up. The weather couldn't really be better for this sort of work, because just as the seed's getting nicely covered with just a light covering of loose soil, the rain's starting to come down and water it in. The poor old birds don't like being out in the rain any more than we do. Once the weather clears, they're ready for a drink and perhaps a bit of a wash and brush up in my wildlife pond. My old lawn's certainly grown, and it's so nice to see the grasses flowering for a change in a garden. And they've got such beautiful old names as well, names like Yorkshire Fog and Timothy and Crested Foxtail and Crested Dog's Tail. And in amongst the grasses, you've got already the seed heads of some of the spring flowers, the spring meadow flowers. This is the fritillarias already casting seed down into the grassland and beginning to colonise. And there are cowslip seed heads in here as well. But there are other meadow flowers that are really only just beginning to flower, like the stitchwort. And then you've got yet more, which won't be flowering for maybe another month, and things like the yarrow there. So you can begin to see how important it is to think about the timing of the cutting of this sort of lawn. If I mow this lot now, that'll be fine for the fritillarias and the cowslips, but I shall wipe out the yarrow completely, and over the next 2 or 3 years it'll disappear. So timing is critical, and different areas of the lawn might be cut at different times. I'm really pleased with the way that the seeded areas started to come together now. There are lots of different species showing through, and some of them have actually flowered and seeded in their first season. But it's crucial, if I want to really encourage the flowers, that the grass is cut at this time of year, the whole thing is raked off to stop the nutrients building up and prevent the sort of development of the very coarse vegetation, because the coarse grasses will squeeze out the wildflowers. So cutting the grass and raking the whole thing off, making the hay, in other words, is vital at this time of year. Well, I guess that's probably the last roll in the hay for this year. I've had so many lovely picnics here, and I think the reason it feels so nice is because it's like being in a woodland glade. It's a real sun trap, and the woodland edge habitat just shelters it perfectly. But if you haven't got enough room for all these trees and bushes, you can get much the same kind of effect by planting a hedgerow. Fences aren't nearly as good for wildlife as hedges are, and this particular fence isn't really very good for anything. It's very much on its last legs. So I've decided to go ahead and demolish it completely. But the fence posts themselves are actually very good. They're oak and they're perfectly sound above ground level. You can see they're pretty rotten below. So I've snapped them off, and I'm gradually replacing them with these fantastic metal bases. There are several more panels to go down here, so if I just knock on it, you can see there's not really a lot of chance of it surviving. I love this demolition work, it's great. Well, a good thick hedge provides a very good nesting habitat anyway, but it's important to think about what you plant. And what I'm mainly sticking in here is hawthorn, about 80% hawthorn. But then I'm also planting things like field maple and wild privet and guelder rose and dog rose, so that eventually what I'll have is a nice tapestry of all of those sorts of plants. And because they're all native plants, they're going to be providing food for caterpillars of a very wide range of insects, as well as this dense nesting habitat. I've included 1 or 2 groups of native privet, Ligustrum vulgare. Most people plant the faster-growing Japanese species, but this one's much better for attracting wildlife, with flowers in the spring and berries in the autumn. It's still more or less evergreen, and it doesn't need clipping quite so often. I've dipped all my plants in a special alginate root dip. It's made from seaweed extract, and it really seems to help get things established quickly, particularly in a dry season. Get the soil good and firm. Push it down between the roots. And don't worry if the plants slope a bit. In fact, if they do lean over, then that seems to make them produce more shoots from the base. In 2 or 3 years, the hedge should be up to head height and ready for clipping. I didn't want any weeds in the first season or 2. They'd compete with the hedge plants for moisture, so I'm putting down a special biodegradable mulch made of a material a bit like roofing felt. That'll just do the job for the 2 or 3 years it's needed, and then rot away. Well, it's high time we started doing something about this edge of woodland habitat that's going to wrap around the back of the meadow. And what I'm going to be planting is obviously trees, a group of alder, English alder, by the marsh area, and then a main belt of silver birch all the way around, which will let lots of light through. And right at the back, a clump of just 5 or so wild cherries, Prunus avium, because they look so good in the autumn when the leaves turn colour. But of course, edge of woodland isn't just about trees, it's about shrubs as well. So underneath that canopy of trees, I'm going to be planting a whole range of native shrubs, wild roses, dogwood, that sort of thing. And eventually, what we shall have is several layers, several canopies, very good habitat for birds and insects and a whole range of other things too. Well, English alder's the classic English waterside tree. And the great thing about it is it grows very fast, so with a bit of luck, it should really start to produce some impact in the garden in a matter of a year or two. Soak it in the root dip, and then basically it's a matter of just making sure you plant it at the right sort of depth, the depth that it was growing at before. Putting the soil in fairly gradually. Don't worry about the lumps of turf, because they'll all rot down. And at this size of tree, sort of 1.5 meters tall, there is no need to stake either, which is a great help. That saves you a couple of pounds a tree. Shaking it around so that the soil gets down into the roots, firming it well. A light sprinkling of the slow-release fertiliser. Very important, a good soaking. Even if it's been raining, get lots of water around the base of your trees, because that gets rid of the air pockets. Fine, I'll just tidy up. And then another of these biodegradable mulches that can go around the bottom and just stops the weeds growing long enough to get the tree well established. The apical bud, the very tip bud, is crucial if the tree's going to grow tall and slim. But it's worth pruning off the side shoots, I think, in this first year, because that gives a real boost to the roots, and it's surprising how much faster the whole tree grows. So just snipping back to a bud, or leaving 1 or 2 buds on each stem, really makes a difference to the rate of growth. With a wildlife garden on your doorstep, it's tempting never to travel out into the countryside ever again, but it's so important that you do. An autumn woodland is so beautiful, and of course this is just the kind of place where I get all the inspiration for those mini habitats back home in the garden. Of course, the reason that this sort of landscape is so very rich in wildlife is partly because there's a great diversity of habitat, edge of woodland, deep woodland and so on, but perhaps most importantly because there's a terrific range of native plants growing here. And just to give you an example of one of them, this is honeysuckle, which is common enough, but honeysuckle growing up a dead birch tree, and if you look carefully at the leaves, you'll see that quite a few of them have got a very strange tracery, a pattern on them. That's evidence of a leaf miner, little insect which lays its eggs into the leaf, and the grubs of that insect crawl about inside the leaf and then escape and find another honeysuckle. That's absolutely specific to this particular plant, and quite a lot of different plants have their own specific leaf miners. And another very specific insect to honeysuckle is the white admiral butterfly, quite a rare butterfly that does actually occur in this particular woodland, and it lays its eggs on the young leaves right at the tip of very old honeysuckle like this. And it's not just insects either. In fact, for instance, there's a bird in this wood which nests here, pied flycatcher, which is really quite a rare bird, and that needs dead trees and holes in dead trees to build its nest. But then it builds its nest and lines its nest with nothing more or less than just the strips of bark from big old honeysuckles like this. So you can see that just this one plant is supporting a whole diversity of wildlife. And you could say exactly the same of all the other native species that are growing in this wood. autumn's a real time of decay, isn't it? And lots of colour around at this time of year. And because this woodland's being managed for conservation, the foresters have left lots of piles of timber around just to rot down and just return the nutrients back to the woodland floor to encourage the trees to grow again. And lots of wood-boring beetles